Many humans have wondered what was on the other side of a nearby hill or a mountain range blocking their horizon. Few have chosen to venture forth into the unknown and uncover what's there. Even fewer have gone to such extremes as those on the Antarctic Terra Nova expedition. This expedition was officially known as the British Antarctic Expedition. Captain Robert Falcon Scott led the voyage that spanned from 1910 to 1913. He and his team set out for knowledge and glory. Instead, they were met with incomparable horrors. Before Scott set out, he had to make some preparations. He established a base at McMurdo Sound, where he and his men could perform their work. But when another explorer, Ernest Shackleton, used the area as his own area of work, Scott set some ambitious goals. Scott gathered 65 personnel from 8,000 applicants. This included 4 hand-picked men who would join him as his closest companions and crew. Lieutenant Edward Evans was Scott's right-hand man, and Edward Adrian Wilson, Lawrence Titus Oates, Henry Robertson Bowers, and Petty Officer Edgar Evans were among those chosen. Scott planned for their transportation methods well ahead of time. He decided they would utilize dog teams and sleds, motor sledges, predecessors of tanks and snowcats, and ponies. Scott's hopes for the ponies were high, but he ended up being profoundly disappointed by their performance. The beginning of the voyage was filled with last-minute bids for funding. As the team and their ships gradually made their way south, via South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, Scott made a shocking discovery. They weren't the only team en route to the pole. Their ship was overloaded with 31 men, 34 dogs, 19 ponies, and 3 sledges. But a few days into the voyage, a huge storm blew through. The crew had to use buckets to bail the ship out, as the pumps on the ship had failed. They also lost some of their supplies, both animal and material. Their bad luck didn't stop there. On January 4, 1911, Terra Nova needed a good spot to get iced in during the winter, one that wouldn't be frozen during the brief summer months. Scott chose Cape Evans, renamed for his second-in-command, which was around 15 miles away from the base Scott chose at Hut Point. As they unloaded the ship to haul their supplies to create accommodation on the Cape, one of the 3 sledges fell into the water. They put the rest of their supplies in and around a pre-constructed shelter, 50 by 25 feet. This would be their biggest defense against the Antarctic winter. In addition to the living shelter, they were able to create scientific observation areas like an ice cave to monitor magnetic observations and a meteorological station. They were ready and prepared for everything they set out to accomplish, or so they thought. Over winter, the men in the hut were able to carve out a livable situation for themselves. Day-to-day goings-on were remarkably ordinary, including the scientific investigations. They were warm, fed, and even entertained by a pianola and gramophone. This state of comfort wouldn't last. Henry Bowers and Apsley Cherry Garrard accompanied Wilson on this treacherous quest. The journey spanned 60 miles, and temperatures dipped as low as -70 F, -57 degrees C. At one point, the wind blew their tent away, leaving them exposed to snowfall in their sleeping bags. 5 weeks after they left, Wilson and his party returned. Their victory of acquiring 3 emperor penguin eggs dampened their enthusiasm. The cold, wind, and snow had left their exposed skin damaged, and they were freezing cold. Cherry Garrard wrote of this journey in his memoir titled The Worst Journey in the World, but the worst was yet to come. By the time spring rolled around, the men were ready to start the bulk of their exploring. It began with the sledges and the ponies and dogs who had to haul the machines. They needed to establish supply points to support the next major journey Scott planned for his team on November 1, 1911, to seek the pole. They brought dogs and ponies to help carry supplies and some additional personnel who would return the animals to the Cape Evans base as the group arrived at the Beardmore Glacier. Their plans would abruptly change. The quest took a turn for the worst. It was long and hard, with an unexpected snowstorm that halted their progress. In fact, this delay might have changed everything for the worst.
The surprise storm trapped them in their tents for 5 days. They even had to break into rations meant for later in the journey. When they were finally freed from the blizzard, they turned the ponies who lived into meat supplies for the return trip, and Scott and his companions forged onto the glacier.
Sending the supply animals and extra manpower back to base seems like a strange choice, but Scott had his reasons. Upon reconsidering the journey's progress and future, Scott believed downsizing the party meant they could more easily disperse rations and carry weights, though this decision might have secured their fates. They reached the pole on January 17, 1912, only to find that the Norwegian team had already been there 34 days earlier. This was quite the blow. They couldn't focus on that at the time, as they still needed to journey all the way back to their main base. On the way back, they came across an abandoned Norwegian campsite with some supplies, a letter, and a note to Scott. In one of their most desperate moments, it seemed like the Norwegians were taunting them. Regardless of the Norwegians' victory, Scott and his party needed to get home. They hiked the glacier for 3 weeks, with Evans and Oates in decreasing states of health. Evans was enduring horrible frostbite, and Oates faced a similar ailment in his feet. On February 7, 1912, they faced more adversity. They couldn't find a supply cache. As they searched, Scott called the group to pause for the day and permitted Wilson to geologize. Wilson discovered samples containing fossils, which would eventually become vital in supporting the continental drift theory. But this brief solace was long-lived. Evans grappled with worsening health conditions. He had a hand injury that wouldn't heal. His frostbite had reached an all-time high, and it was believed that he'd hit his head a couple of times on ice. Scott wrote that he was absolutely changed from his normal, self-reliant self. By the time they reached the bottom of the glacier, things took a turn for the worse for Evans. His health failed completely, and he fell unconscious. A little more than a month after they reached the pole, Evans' body gave out, and he expired on February 17, 1912. Sadly, this wouldn't be the last fatality of this journey. After losing their companion, Scott and the others forged on. They managed to keep up their pace enough to be 3 days earlier than the original schedule, but Scott didn't let his guard down. They could easily, and would, encounter another disaster. The remaining men were slowed down by Oates's foot, which was growing worse by the day. They were supposed to meet with another team member who was supposed to bring a dog team with him, but Scott wondered if they'd missed the meeting point. It was that same day that Oates made a noble decision, a virtuous decision in an attempt to save his friends. That night, while he and his companions were crowded into their tent, Oates's mind was made up. He was slowing them down with his injury and jeopardizing the excursion. He said, "I'm just going outside, and maybe sometime." Oates walked into the -40°F, -40°C blizzard and never returned. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers couldn't stop to look for his lost friend. They continued on toward One Ton Depot, where they would have been able to resupply before making the last jaunt home. But no dog teams came to help, and they couldn't find the depot. Then, things took a turn for the worse. Oates' sacrifice made a difference in their speed, but they couldn't outpace another blizzard. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers were about 11 miles south of One Ton Depot when the storm arrived. They tried to keep going, but the storm made it impossible.
Scott wrote in his diary, "Every day we have been ready to start for our depot, 11 miles away, but outside the door of the tent remains a scene of whirling drift." Supplies were running low, and they were beginning to think they wouldn't make it back. Their desperation was high, and their situation was dire. The 3 men froze, their bodies unable to withstand the harsh conditions any longer. The rest of the expedition team at Cape Evans waited long enough to know for sure that their leader and fellow explorers wouldn't return to base. But they still weren't done with the expedition. As Scott's team fought for their lives, leadership at Cape Evans transferred to Edward L. Atkinson. He ordered Cherry Garrard, who had since returned to base, to seek out the fallen party. With one companion and 2 dog teams, he set out into the wilderness to look for Scott's party. Cherry Garrard had to make some hard calls. When Scott and the others proved lost, he had to decide if he was going to risk losing some of the sled dogs to keep looking, or turn back. In the end, he turned back to avoid this risk. But when a new detail came to light, he regretted his choices. Scott's party was only 70 miles away from where Cherry Garrard was searching. If he had chosen a different course of action, he might have been able to save the polar party. This possibility plagued Cherry Garrard until his last days. After a second rescue mission was unsuccessful, it took a whole year before the expedition finally came to an end. Ex-Royal Navy officer Victor Campbell took command, and on January 18, 1913, the Terra Nova returned to retrieve the remaining scientists and explorers. A wooden cross was erected near their living quarters to commemorate the fallen party. Despite losing the pole race to the Norwegians, the British public was more focused on the loss of such great men. It was easy to overlook a lot of the mission due to their passing. Even the immense scientific legacy of this expedition was overlooked, and the scientists on the expedition made extensive contributions to several different areas. The Terra Nova expedition saw many highs and lows, but is truly a testament to human willpower and perseverance. The loss of life shouldn't outweigh the great successful scientific discoveries, nor vice versa. In the end, the ship itself was lost during World War II off the southern coast of Greenland. If that story gave you chills, just wait. There's a lot more where that came from. Hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good scare, and drop a comment telling us what you would have done. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories coming your way.